So, let's talk about Article 1291, Novation. So, obligation may be modified by number 1, changing their object or principal condition. Number 2, by substituting the person of the debtor. Number 3, by subrogating a third person the rights of the creditor. So, let's define novation. Novation is a total or partial extinction of an obligation through the creation of the new which substitutes it. So, the substitution or change of an obligation by one another is which extinguished or modified in the first, either by changing its object or principal condition or by substituting another in place of the debtor or subrogating a third person in the rights of the creditor. So, novation has dual function and its number 1, original obligation is extinguished. So, kaya andito siya sa extinguishment of obligation kasi nga ang original obligation ay na-extinguish. So, number 2, a new obligation is created. So, yung novation is the most unusual mode of extinguishing in obligation. Kasi nga, it is the only mode whereby an obligation is extinguished and a new obligation is created to take its place. So, kaya nga, unique yung novation kasi after mong extinguish yung obligation, nag-create ka agad ng bago. So, there are 9 kinds of novations and its classification. So, A, according to origin. So, legal. Number 1, legal. That which take place by operation of law. So, para naman yun. So, 2, conventional. That which take place by agreement of the parties. So, B, according to how it's constituted. So, number 1, express when so declared in unequivocal terms. Number 2, implied when the old and the new obligation are essentially incompatible with each other. So, hindi sila mapapagsama. So, how implied novation is done? So, A, by making substantial changes in object or subject matter of the contract. So, meaning, from a cellphone, papalitan mo yung object ng bracelet or to a ring or etc. So, B, by making substantial changes in the cost or consideration of the contract. So, substantial changes is meaning the price. So, if yung purchase cost is 500, tapos dinaasan mo siya ng 1,000, so that is novation. So, now, if yung price is nireduce mo naman from 500 to 300, remember, hindi na siya novation kasi it's actual implied remission na. So, reduce in price is remission. So, C, by making substantial changes in the principal terms or condition of the contract. So, principal terms is yung gagawin mo siyang from 6 months to 1 year. Tapos, sa conditions naman is yung from conditional obligation, gagawin mo siyang pure obligation. So, yun yung substantial changes in principal terms and condition. So, C, according to extent or effect. So, total extensive when the old obligation is completely extinguished. So, number 2, partial, modificatory, imperfect, or improper when the old obligation is merely modified and to change is merely incidental to the main obligation, to the original obligation still remains in force except and so far as it has been modified. So, ito yung pinaka-important. So, according to the subject or object or purpose. So, number 1, real or object. So, when the object or cost or principal condition of the obligation are changed. So, for example, si S is nag-agree siya to deliver to B a car. So, later, they entered in the another contract whereby instead of S delivering a car, he would deliver 10 air conditioners. So, the obligation to deliver the car is extinguished by the obligation to deliver the 10 air conditioners. So, the change may involve the principal terms of the obligation. So, kaya siya tinawag na real obligation is yung object and principal condition are na bago or na change. So, Number 2, personal or subjective. So, when the person of the debtor is substituted and or when the third person is subrogated in the rights of the creditor. So, for example, after so if after the constitution is so for example, if after the constitution of the obligation, both party agree that C will substitute for S or that D will subrogate in the rights of B. So there is personal novation in this case. So C become the new debtor and D become the new creditor. So in this case, personal obligation is yung yung pinalitan mo yung persons, either debtor or creditor. So kinds of personal or subjective novation. So A, passive novation, substituting the person of the debtor. So mukhang balik-balik lang, so sabi lang. So remember, if you change the debtor, it's called passive novation. So kinds of passive novation or substitution. So expromission, that which take place when a third person of his initiative and without knowledge or against the will of the original debtor assumes the latter's obligation with the consent of the creditor. So expromission. So number 2, delegation. So that which take place when the creditor accept a third person to take the place of the debtor and instant of the latter. So the initiative to change the debtor here, it came from the original debtor himself. So tapos yung third person, yun na yung papalit sa kanya. So yung third person and original debtor and creditor should consent to the delegation. So B, active novation by subrogating the third person in the rights of creditor. So yun na yun. So number 2, conventional or voluntary subrogation. That's that which take place by agreement of the parties. So mukhang legal and yung katulad kanina. So ito ang last 3, mix. So when the object and or principal conditions of the obligation and the debtor or creditor of both parties are changed, it is combination of real and personal novation. So pag sinabi mong mix, yun yung papalitan yung persons like creditor, debtor, and papalitan din yung subject. So yun tinawag siya na mix. So next reporter, please.
So Article 1292. In order that an obligation may be extinguished by another which substitutes the same, it is imperative that it be so declared in unequivocal terms, or that the old and the new obligations be on every point incompatible with each other. So the cancellation of the old obligation by the new one is a necessary element of novation, which may be effected either expressly or impliedly, while there is really no hard and fast rule to determine what might constitute sufficient change resulting in novation. The touchstones, however, is irreconcilable incompatibility between the old and the new obligations. And novation is not presumed, it must be clearly and unmistakably established either by the express agreement of the parties or acts of equivalent import. So, novation. What is novation? Novation is defined as the extinguishment of an obligation by the substitution or change of the obligation by a subsequent one which terminates the first, either by the changing the object or principal conditions, or by substituting the person of the debtor, or subrogating a third person in the rights of the creditor. So novation is not presumed when both parties did not execute a new contract. Novation will not exist. It is also noted that since novation is never presumed, a new executed contract must establish that the old and new ones are incompatible in all points, and that the will to novate must be expressly agreed upon by both parties or any acts equivalent to the former. So next, test of incompatibility between two obligations or contracts. The test is whether they can stand together, each one having an independent existence. If they cannot, they are incompatible. and the subsequent obligation novates the first. Upon such novation, the former obligation loses all its force and effect, and only the new obligation can be forced. Next, requisites of novation. First one is a previous valid obligation. The second one is the capacity and intention of the parties to modify or extinguish the obligation. Third, the modification or extinguishment of the obligation. And the last one is the creation of a new valid obligation. That's all. Thank you.